Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry De Silva. Well, it's always very nice when we can look back at Hollywood and some of its many fine actors, actresses, cast of characters. Today we're going to discuss a book, and the gentleman who, of course, had a fine career in the show business, radio, television, newspapers, you name it, he did it all. Maxwell Emmett Buttram. And you say, the last name sounds familiar. Well, professionally, he was known as Pat Buttram, and he was a character actor known for many years playing Gene Autry, the superstar cowboy's sidekick, and later on made television history again by playing the well-known Mr. Haney on the long-running television series Green Acres. He had a distinctive voice that, in his own words, quote, never quite made it through puberty. And we are joined by the author of the book. The book is called Pat Buttram, Rocking Chair Humorist. Sandra Grabman joins us, and she has written this fine book, publisher Bear Manor Media. And Sandy, welcome to Studio 411. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine. How are you?
Good, good. And joining us for added insight, we also have an actor in his own right, and a gentleman that, through no fault of his own, is the nephew of Pat Buttram, fine gentleman and actor as well, John Buttram. John, how are you, sir?
Oh, we're doing great.
There you go.
Good to hear you.
He has that distinctive voice that sounds very much like his uncle. Now, clarify for me, you are related through which of Pat's siblings? Give us the family tree there.
Okay, Dad was the oldest son, and Pat was the youngest. And I think there were 8 kids in all. So, but they were pretty close, really were.
And now, but I'm saying when you came along, now, which of the brothers or sisters, in other words, who was your parent and their relation, I assume was a brother or sister to Pat, correct?
Yes, my dad was John Buttram, Sr.
Okay. Yeah. There you go. All right. So now we know from where once he came there for sure. Sandy, what inspired you to write this book about this fine actor?
Well, I've admired Pat throughout my life. I loved him as Mr. Haney and Gene Autry's sidekick. And after I'd written biographies of Albert Salmi and then Peggy Ann Garner, the publisher said, okay, who do you want to write about next? So I thought, oh, good. Okay, I'll write about Pat. So we were off and running.
There you go. Pat, of course, for those of you who don't know, was born June 19th, 1915 in Addison, Alabama, and given the birth name Maxwell. Sandy, tell me a little bit about his family. I understand, Sandy, that his dad came from a long line of ministers.
Yes, in fact, it's still been the tradition is being carried on. His brother Gus was a minister, and he's now passed on, but now Gus's son Mac is a minister. And
now at the age of 8, little Maxwell got the acting bug. How did that occur?
You mean when he was preaching in the forest to the trees?
Well, that too, but at age 8, wasn't he in some sort of church play? Again, probably in the church that his dad was a minister in.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he thought he was going to be a minister till that happened and kind of changed all his plans.
I'll say. John, how did your Uncle Pat get the nickname Pat? Tell us about how that occurred.
Well, Dad went to Auburn University, and back then when the freshmen, they called them rats, and so they had this rat cap, little beanie they wore, and it had rat on it. Well, Dad wore it, and so when he got to be a sophomore, he gave it to Pat. Well, Pat wore it, and part of the R got torn off, so it looked like it spelled Pat. And so everybody started calling him Pat.
There you go. Before I get too far into the interview, I want to show a little video that we have that talks a little bit about the book, as well as gives us some additional insight on Mr. Pat Buttram. And then we'll be back with our guests here on Studio 411. Let's take a look.
We spent $1 billion or so to find out if there's intelligent life on Mars. I can tell you, yes, there is intelligent life on Mars, 'cause they haven't spent 1 cent to find out about us. I don't know if you know it or not, but I come from a town that's so small they don't even have a sanitation department. Just a woman comes by in twice a week to tidy up. Don't go around with your nose up in the air. People might think you can't afford a handkerchief. The only sure way to get rid of an enemy is to make a friend out of him. Why do they let funeral processions go through red lights? What's the hurry? You know you're getting old when someone compliments you on your alligator shoes and you're barefoot.
And there you go, back with our guest, Sandy Grabman, and also John Buttram, nephew of our subject today, Pat Buttram. The book, Pat Buttram, Rocking Chair Humorist, in its second edition and published by Bear Manor Media, www.bearmanormedia.com. And Sandy, remind me, give us your website as well.
It's my name, SandraGrabman.com.
There we go, simple enough. All right. Tell me now, Sandy, Pat graduated high school at 17 and won a scholarship to a Methodist school. Tell me about that. And also, give us an insight, and I'll ask John as well afterwards. Back in those days, in the roaring 20s, as I guess they called them, give us a little kind of picture of Alabama. That was not exactly the most prosperous state. I mean, people lived very simply back then.
In fact, his dad was a circuit riding minister, and they didn't have a whole lot of money at all. So in order to save on textbook cost, Pat was advanced a year, and his brother Gus was held back a year. So they were in the same grade and used the same textbooks.
Okay, so that explains why then Pat actually graduated a year younger than most, at age 17 as opposed to 18, because he actually moved up a little bit. And from what I can see, he certainly was quite the intelligent and resourceful young man.
Yeah, a lot of people are surprised to find out he went to college, but he got the radio bug, and that kind of put an end to his college career.
Now, John, from talking to the relatives back in the day, obviously you came along much later, but give me a feeling for those of us here in this part of the country again. Even in your growing up, had life changed a lot in Alabama compared to when Pat and your dad were around?
Oh, yeah, it's changed a whole lot. It's not as rural as it used to be. A lot of cities are expanding. People have moved in, and it's changed quite a bit. When Pat was on radio back in the 30s at WLS, people would write him a letter, and one just said, Pat Buttram, Winston County, Alabama, and it got to him. No zip code, no address or anything, So I don't think you'd do that nowadays.
Yeah, indeed. Now, let's see, Sandy, additional good faith stepped in as well. How did he come about to break into the radio business at such a young age?
Well, he started out at the local radio station. He was 18 years old and was called the Hillbilly Announcer for WSGN radio in Birmingham. And he would MC the Happy Holler Barn Dance for a station. And after a while, they used him for more and more things. They found out he could write humor wonderfully. And then it was, you want me to go as far as Chicago, or is that later?
Well, I was going to say, from there he headed to WLS in Chicago.
Yeah, I think it was a station manager at WSGN figured, we're holding him back down here. I need to take him up to the World's Fair where the WLS, world's largest store. That's what it makes.
Oh, okay. It was probably, I wonder if it was owned by Sears.
Yeah.
There you go.
And they were doing a man on the street thing, so they had planned for him to be the man on the street. And he just charmed the daylights out of them, and they hired him.
And I see that one of his first checks was for $15, and he did the good son thing and brought the check home and gave it to Dad. $15 in those days was a lot of money.
Yeah, that's right.
Indeed. Now, again, when he was there, he got to work or meet a lot of people that in their own right were going to be future stars in their own right. Talk a little bit about, Sandy, about some of the big names that came out of that station.
Well, on the same day he began work, so did Patsy Montana at the same station. And that's where he met Gene Autry and George Goebel, Smiley Burnett, Homer and Jethro, Andy Williams. Oh, it's a bunch of them.
I was going to Rex Allen. I was going to say, and when I saw the Andy Williams, I'm saying, Andy, my goodness, he looked young in the 50s. He must have been, because he was with the Williams brothers. He and his brothers had a singing group, so yeah. I didn't know he was from that part of the country. But my goodness, he must have been barely a teenager in those days. But look at Pat. Pat was probably not even able to vote at that point. I don't even know for sure.
That's right.
My goodness. Now, John, I think we can understand Pat's long-lasting success. He used intelligent material, but gave it kind of a country delivery. Would you say that's a good description of Pat and his success?
Yeah, he used that down-home humor a lot. And when he went up to Chicago, I told Sandy this one time, his mother made him a shirt out of flour sacks. Now, you're probably too young to know about that, but flour used to come in 25 and 50-pound sacks, and they had prints on them, and people would meet every now and then and swap and get enough sacks to make a shirt or a dress or something. But that's what he wore when he went to Chicago the first time.
Wow. That's impressive. And wasn't there a photo I saw, I think, in the book, Sandy, where I think between the boys there was one suit and they kind of took turns wearing it?
Yeah, because they didn't have much money. They could only afford one suit for their sons. So they just took turns wearing the suit.
Now, at that station at WLS back around 1934, he meets, of course, Gene Autry and forged a long-lasting relationship. Tell us a little bit about that. What was Gene doing there? Was he doing radio work as well?
Yeah, he was, and he was also going on personal appearances, county fairs, that sort of thing, and he took Pat with him. And he also was in the movies then. So sometimes he took a leave of absence from the station to go to Hollywood to make a movie, and then he'd come back.
So, yeah, and I detect amongst those gentlemen and many others that you talk about in the book, there was a little bit more of a loyalty, not only towards each other and the way they dealt with each other, business dealings, but also it seemed like as far as broadcasting went, that these folks had a certain loyalty to their bosses, and their bosses seemed to treat them pretty well.
Yeah, that's right. And they became very professional. If Pat was with Gene and doing a radio show, and Gene might have slurred a word or two, Pat would ask that they stop the tape and then do it again, because he knew that you had to enunciate very well to be understood on radio.
Oh, indeed, yeah. It's amazing that they were able to use tape back in those days. Of course, reel-to-reel tape, I'm sure videotape in television didn't come along for much longer. But and editing with the old editing block, a razor blade, and patch it together for sure. Pat met his future wife, his first wife in Chicago. Tell us a little bit about he and Dorothy.
She was a cigarette girl at a restaurant he went to. And they started dating, and they fell in love and got married.
And now, John, did you know Pat's first wife at all? Did you ever get to meet her?
Yeah, she came to Alabama one time, and we've got pictures of the whole family with her. And also, he had an adopted daughter, and we've got pictures of her also with my grandfather and with the whole family.
And now that was adopted, again, sadly, Pat and Dorothy were unable to have their own children, so they adopted a daughter. Sandy, what was her name again?
Gail.
Dale, okay.
Gayle.
Gotcha. Now, John, can you share some well-known Pat sayings? I guess at one point he called them Whitlands was a term Pat used when he was on the radio.
Yeah. Whitlands. I wanted this one. I don't remember if it was in the book or not, but this is something that he used, and I'll tell you. I noticed that y'all were broadcasting from Farmington, Connecticut. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You may not know this, but Farmington, Connecticut has, I guess, some of the smartest people in the whole country. That's true. They everybody in Farmington knows where New York City is.
Okay. All right. I think you're overestimating the intelligence, but I'll give you that. Okay. We can tell some
like,
stories. There we go.
A bird in the hand can be awful messy.
And now, from the best of your knowledge, again, it would have been great that Sandy probably doesn't know this. I'm not sure John does. Why someone didn't convince him at some point in time, because he lived a pretty long life, to take these and put them in book form, all these sayings that he had. I mean, they would have been a bestseller.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. I know he wrote for a newspaper, and it was pretty well syndicated, and he usually had a lot of those in there. And then he was on WLS from 1934 to 1945. And they had a weekly magazine, and so he had little quips in there also. So it would take quite a bit to put them all together, but it could be done.
Oh, it would be, I think it would be a bestseller. Sandy, get on it.
Well, I've got a lot of his original one-liners in the book.
Yeah, in the book, but I'm telling you, he's got enough to fill a book twice the size from what I can tell. It's
right.
Amazing. Sandra.
You know, another thing, when he got off WLS, he was on the Roy Rogers radio program for 2 years. And then in 1948, he made the first movie with Gene Autry, Strawberry Roan.
We have a picture of Pat with Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. Look at that. Someone said to me, "Who's that young lady?" I mean, Dale. She was. Oh my goodness! See, look at that. Look at the guy in the back without a mustache. That's Pat Buttram. Yeah, and along with Roy Rogers. Where's Trigger? I don't see. What was her horse's name?
Buttermilk, wasn't it?
Buttermilk. Yes. They later continued to entertain, but long after they were gone. But amazing. Sandra Grabman, author of Pat Buttram, Rocking Chair Humorist, joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. Also joining us, actor and nephew of Pat Buttram, John Buttram. So we appreciate them both joining us. John, in 1941, your grandmother died, Pat's mom, and he helped tend to his ill brother Gus. gave him some medical assistance, brought him to Chicago. Talk a little bit about that. He got him in touch with some specialists, right? He had some medical issues?
I think so, but I think most of that was done in Birmingham, Alabama. And Gus got a fever when he was playing football, and it didn't paralyze him at the time. But when he was in Birmingham, they had to do a bone graft, and they took a out of his leg bone and put it into his back. And when they did, it pinched a nerve, and it paralyzed one side of him. So that's how Gus got paralyzed.
Gotcha.
But Gus walked, I guess, until he was in his 60s or maybe 70s. I don't know. I can remember him walking very well.
There you go. Sandra, in the mid-40s, fame and fortune, I guess, just was too much. Pat moved to California and also went through a bitter divorce. So talk a little bit about that particular part of his life.
Well, he and Dorothy just couldn't get along, and so she divorced him, and she wouldn't let him see Gail, their daughter, anymore. And that just broke his heart. But he would come back into his life later, so he was happy about that.
In 1946, Pat is reunited with an old friend, Gene Autry, and as we said earlier, of course, after spending a brief time working with Roy Rogers in some of his productions, he got reunited with the superstar himself, singer, actor, Gene Autry. And actually, we have a trailer to show the folks from one of their movies, Beyond the Purple Hills. And we're going to take a look at that here on Studio 411, and then we'll be back with our guests and talk some more.
Love your dear hearts, you gentle people who live and love in my hometown, who live and love in my hometown.
You gonna close up my games? If you don't clean it up so it's honest, I will. You mean I'm a crooked gambler?
What do you want?
We want Jack Beaumont. This town's sick and tired of the way you're protecting a murderer.
You can't have him.
And there you have it. I always love those Western trailers, and that's a great one from one of the Gene Autry movies, along with his sidekick, Pat Buttram. And we are here on Studio 411, the book Pat Buttram, Rocking Chair Humorist, and our guests, Sandra Grabman, as well as actor in his own right and nephew of Pat Buttram, John Buttram, joining us via satellite. Let's see, Sandy rather. Pat learned some skills as far as with pratfalls and kind of action takes. I was fascinated. He learned this from the great Buster Keaton. Share a little bit with us.
Yeah, he taught him how to fall so that he wouldn't really hurt himself. And he told him it's very important to, especially if there's children in the audience, to get up quickly and let them know you're all right. Because if they think he's hurt, they won't laugh. But if they know he's not hurt, then it'll be hilarious. They'll laugh their heads off.
Now, the thing that helped Buster, of course, was when Buster was in his prime. If you recall, the movies in those silent years ran very quickly. Instead of, was it 24 frames per second, there was a differential there. So of course, yeah, he always looked like he got up like lickety split because of the way the the action was. But yeah, he was a master at that for sure. John, 1949, Pat meets the woman who would become his second wife, actress Sheila Ryan. Share with us memories of. I'm sure you got to know her in your youth.
Yeah, they met on Gene Autry's set, and Sandy might know the date better than I do, but in the early 50s, they were filming a movie, and there was a cannon that exploded. And back then, they didn't really know enough about static electricity and, just what would set things off. Well, there was a cloud came over, and it set this cannon off, and it just blew up, and it hit Pat. And Gene got hold of everybody, and they went up and got the cars lined up, and he called for a pilot to come in, and they took him to the hospital, and Sheila was with him all the time. And they called Granddad, and Granddaddy was a Methodist preacher, and so was Gus. And of course, they both started immediate praying. And I know Granddad said that he prayed for at least 2 days, if not longer, continuously. No food, no water, no anything. And they called Dad, and Dad was the businessman of the family, and Dad started making all the funeral arrangements. And he would call the hospital, and they would say, well, he's got a 20% chance of living. And it got up to 35 and 40, 50. And finally, he was all right, So we all prayed, and we think prayer is one thing that pulled him through.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that everybody should know and approve of and do. But, Sheila was with him the whole time, and they got married. And there's quite a few funny anecdotes with her. She came to Alabama one time to visit the family. And Pat, they came from England. They had been over there on a tour with Gene. And Pat bought this big, heavy brooch. The thing must have weighed a pound or two. And he said, now, this was my grandmother's, and said, you can wear it when we get to the family there, and said, they'll appreciate that. So Sheila was small in stature, and here she's wearing this, heavy necklace. And so my Aunt Peggy, who was the oldest, went up to her and said, oh, that's a very pretty necklace. Said, where did you get it? And Sheila knew then that Pat had kind of duped her a little bit there,
Busted.
Now, we had a shot, if we can go back to that shot, I believe it's a poster from the movie. I believe it was Mule Train. Am I correct on that, the movie?
Yeah, that's the one that he met Sheila in.
Yeah, and the folks at home, I can see it, and I don't even have my glasses on. I believe at the bottom where they have the people that are in the movie, I believe there's a cannon there. So I thought, now I understand how prophetic that was, the fact that cannon played a big part. And I wonder if that movie was even delayed, because once he got hurt, I wonder if there was even thought to maybe kind of hold back until they knew that Gene was out of the woods, as they say.
It was after that movie had wrapped. The accident happened when they were doing a TV show.
Indeed, indeed. Now, fill me in, Sheila Ryan, do either one of you know, she was in quite a few movies in her own right back in the day, before she even met Gene, correct?
Yeah,
Right.
She was, and just a quick trip to the Internet Movie Database would tell you everything you need to know.
There you go. There you go. Sandy is full of helpful hints today, let me tell you. Sandy, we'll go back to you. September 1950. Well, we talk about that. Yeah, it cost him his life. So again, that was an awful thing. But then, in addition to doing the movies, then Gene started a series, the Gene Autry Show, which I believe they filmed about, 100 or so episodes?
I've got it in the book how many, but I can't remember.
There you go.
I wrote it over a decade ago. My memory's not real good.
Now, John, do you remember watching that show as a young man?
Oh yeah, yeah, and it's I've got all of them. Gene Autry Entertainment sent me a list, and all of them on DVDs, so I can watch them anytime.
Nice. And that's one thing too. To digress a minute, the folks at Gene Autry, is his widow still alive?
She was when I interviewed.
Oh, okay. Yes, that's very important.
Yeah, but like I say, that was about 10 years ago or more.
But they.
You talking about Jackie Autry?
Yes. Is she still with us?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I talked to her secretary last week, about 2 weeks ago.
There you go.
And she was doing fine.
Yeah, because they seem to have done quite a marvelous job in terms of maintaining Gene's legacy and keeping his work in the public eye. And I don't know if it's on TV on a regular basis, but I know a lot of the movies and TV shows, and I think it's good. I think it's good. It's like when you turn on the Lone Ranger or the Roy Rogers show. I think it's good entertainment for young and old alike.
Yeah, it's very wholesome.
Indeed. Now, after the Gene Autry show and radio, and plus he had a radio show. I mean, the Gene Autry, again, a lot of people forget that, but they remember the name every Christmas, every holiday season when you start hearing these songs. What in baseball, they would call him a 4 or 5 tool player. I mean, actor, singer, television star, film star. I mean, did either one of you ever meet Mr. Autry when he was alive or no?
Oh yeah, several times. They used to come to Alabama with the Gene Autry show and rodeo and everything, that they would, tour every year all over the country. And so I got to meet Gene several times as a kid, and then when I was a little bit older too. But a very nice man. Very, very nice.
And I also I have to interject, too, for those who say, well, you forgot about this. He also later on, in 1961, I believe, when the American League in Baseball expanded, the then Los Angeles Angels, later California Angels, et cetera, he was the principal owner of the Angels. So, again, talk about, having a good income to be able, even in those days, to be able to purchase and run a major league franchise. And I believe his wife Jackie took over running that for a time after he passed. But the thing about Gene always, I remember, never got to the World Series.
Oh.
Yeah, came close, but I don't know. John might remember. The Angels were within, I think, one strike of going to the series, and was a famous home run hit against the Red Sox, and Gene Mock, and who was the manager at that time, it all went down in flames.
Aw.
Yeah, unfortunately, never got to the series. But anyway, back.
But they did finally win.
Oh, finally! But this was while Gene was still alive. Yeah. Jackie
right.
was around to see that. When the TV show and radio show ended in '56, then Pat was able to draw attention to nightclub work. I'll address this to John. And we talked earlier, again, keeping in mind that he still kept a hand in radio and probably some columns as well. So he must have been a tremendous budgeter of his time to be able to do all the things he did simultaneously.
Yeah, and Pat was quite a writer. I know he was in Vegas. He had a show in Vegas for a while. He wrote for a lot of people. Pat's memory was fantastic. It was just, I guess he knew just about every joke that there was. And another thing is, he could make up and write jokes. And if you ever try to do that, it's kind of hard. But, he'd pick up a newspaper, and he'd say, oh, here's a deal in the classified. Here's a 1982 Chevrolet for sale. Take up payments. And, just things like that, just off the top of his head.
Indeed, and later on became known as, not only, as you said, as a writer, but then became a very popular after-dinner speaker for many groups. There's a story in the book, Sandy, about He helped the well-known at that time Arthur Godfrey, who was between television work at that point and helped put some ideas together for a series of specials that he did. So he, amazing. He's like a five-tool player, I'm telling you. He could do it all.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, he was like Gene in that sense, only Gene had more money, I think.
Yeah. Pat said that Gene used to ride into the sunset, but now he could buy it.
There you go, indeed. Pat got to work with Elvis on 3 films, and
Right.
What do you remember about that, John? You ever meet Elvis, or no, you weren't?
I never met Elvis. I think after he did Roustabout, he came back to Alabama, and he'd come back and stay for a week or so with us. But he said Elvis was a very nice, polite young man. And he said Barbara Stanwyck was a real professional. She not only knew her lines, but everybody else's, and she expected perfection from everyone.
Indeed. We've got a
And
shot
so
of...
they got along real good together.
We've got a shot of Pat probably being counseled by Ms. Stanwyck during the filming of Roustabout, and before that we had a picture of Elvis on a motorcycle from that same movie, and there you go, the king, looking fine, looking for love in all the wrong places. Oh my goodness. Now let's see. Another thing too is he filled in for Gene on an Ed Sullivan show, I understand, and then Sandy enjoyed his performance so much that he had him back on quite often for a time.
Yes, I forget how many it was, but he made a contract that he'd be on maybe 6 or 8 times that year.
Very popular indeed. John, Pat was a rare comedian who could easily excel in dramatic roles as well as comedy. Why do you think he had such an easy time with it, where so many dramatic people can't do comedy and so many comics can't, not be funny? In other words, can't get into a serious role.
Yeah. Pat, of course, comedy came natural to him, but he said drama was, so that came pretty easy too. And he did a deal for Alfred Hitchcock called The Jar. And I think it got an Emmy. But he did quite a good job in that one. He was well known for it.
Indeed.
I don't know if you've ever seen it, but
no, I know he did 2 Hitchcock episodes, but
right.
But I saw a little clip of the one I think you're referencing, and was very convincing. In other words, I didn't picture either his character with Gene or Mr. Haney. That's another thing to go back. We'll stick with John on this one. I thought I read in the book at some point, either during the movie phase or certainly when they did the radio and TV shows, there were no like characters. It just became, well, Gene was Gene and Pat was Pat. Am I correct on that?
That's right.
Yeah.
For quite a while, they'd have different names for Pat on the show. Gene always had the same name. And so finally, on one of the shows, he said, "Okay, Pat, what's your name this time?" And he said, "From now on, it's going to be Pat." So that after that particular thing, from then on, it was Pat Buttram.
And quite often they were doing more than one show at a time. And,
yes.
And it would be confusing to Gene. Okay, what is his name on this one?
Well, it just made it easier. Again, Gene struck me from reading the book that was another person that did a lot of multitasking as well. So, this way it just streamlined the process. Now, John may know this as well. The first time Pat worked with Gene, not in the radio days, but in movies, he was not the sidekick in 1 or 2 of the early appearances. Am I correct on that?
That's right. That's right.
So he played like kind of did he play a heavy, or did he just play kind of an extra character,
He was just an extra character. I think in Strawberry Roan, he just was a kind of a hand that worked on the ranch there. Had a little comic relief to it, but not a lot. He didn't get into that till third or fourth picture, maybe.
Gotcha. 1965 comes the TV series or TV vehicle that will cement Pat's legacy as well as his career forever in viewers. And, I know sometimes people are like, oh, well, I don't want to be remembered for this, but I got to tell you, before we started, one of our crew members literally sang me the entire Green Acres song. So, and I told her I was going to bring her out here, but I don't think she wants to come out. But that's amazing. Amazing that the influence and that show is still seen all over the world. We have a little promo clip from back in the day that we're going to run so that all of you, in case you've forgotten or your memory needs to be jarred, you'll see these folks that Pat got to work with for 6 seasons. The series was Green Acres, and then we'll be back for more on Studio 411 with our guests. Let's take a look.
They enjoy community cultural activities and a nice home at a fraction of city cost with running water, modern gadgets,
Haven't you ever used this?
Oh, yes, to hold the door open.
and a telephone.
Hello?
There are adequate facilities for livestock and fine law enforcement.
Now let us out!
Mr. Douglas will tell you about it himself.
Who's calling us this time of night?
Darling, relax.
What a stupid place to put a telephone.
Raining again, eh? Well, that's why we call it Green Acres.
And we are back. Love seeing those clips. Whether it's in black and white or color, it's always good to me. All right. We are back, and our guest, Sandra Grabman, author of Pat Buttram, Rocking Chair Humorist, published by Bear Manor Media, www.bearmanormedia.com, as well as sandragrabman.com. And joining us as well to offer his insight, nephew of Pat Buttram and an actor in his own right, Mr. John Buttram. So we thank them for spending this time with us. John, Pat gave back to the community an awful lot. I got the impression via benefits and public appearances. He liked to also get back to Alabama as often as he could. Talk to us about those two things.
Well, he'd come back usually and see Granddad, his dad, for 2 or 3 days, and then he would come down and see Dad. And Dad had a radio station, and so Pat would kind of keep everything low key for 2 or 3 days, and that's when we got to see him and be around him a lot. And then Dad would go around and they would kind of press the flesh, with everybody that was advertising on radio, and so we got to know him pretty good. And when I was 16, I was the only one in the family that had a driver's license and was old enough to ride around, and I worked as an announcer at Dad's station. But if Pat came into Birmingham or somewhere, Dad would send me to go pick him up and carry him around to different places. So we had quite a good time together.
Indeed.
And I know one deal they had in Gadsden, Alabama, it was a kind of a Boy Scout or a jamboree type deal, and it was at a football field. And so they all came out, all the scouts came out, and they were kind of like knights in shining armor, and they had little wooden swords. And they started running Pat off the field, kind of as a comedy routine deal, and they started hitting him with those little wooden swords. He was black and blue when they got through with him,
Sandy, though, we'll get back to the Green Acres. Of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time. This iconic show, as said, ran for probably nearly 200 episodes and for 6 seasons on CBS. Both of you, we'll start with Sandy. Tell me, how did Pat feel about that break in his career?
Oh, he loved it because it was regular work, a regular paycheck, and he was home every night for dinner with his family. And he was working with wonderful people, Eddie Albert, Ava Gabor, Tom Lester, Alvy Moore, Mary Grace Canfield, Sid Milton, Frank Cady, and Hank Patterson. And
don't forget Arnold the Pig.
And Arnold the pig,
That's
the
right.
star of the show.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Indeed.
And his daughter told me that there were no egos on that set. They were all very professional and knew their lines and knew they were just wonderful to work with.
I just saw, to digress a minute, I saw a clip recently of the old Merv Griffin show. Folks in our age group remember Merv Griffin. This was from like 1965, 66. I guess they were doing like a publicity tour. The show had started, began filming in the summer of 65, 66 season began its run. And I tell you, Ava couldn't say enough about Eddie, and Eddie couldn't say enough about Ava, and all these, marvelous characters on the show. So again, it must have been a fun time. John, what do you recall about not only that show but your uncle's participation in that series?
Well, I know I told you this, I think, earlier, but I'll try to repeat it as quickly as I can. When Beverly Hillbillies came out, they gave Pat a script, and he said, "This is the silliest thing in the world." Said, "Nobody's going to watch this." And of course, he knew Buddy Ebsen. They were real close friends, and so he lined him up, and he knew Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs and several other people. When Green Acres came up, they called him in, and they wanted him to play the part of Sam Drucker, the store owner. And he read the script, and he said, "Well, let me try for Mr. Haney." And they said, "He sells the farm, and he takes the money and leaves." And he says, "Let me play with him a little bit." So he patterned Haney after Colonel Tom Parker, who was Elvis's advisor, or whatever you want to call him.
Yeah, he was an advisor.
But anyway, that's how he got Mr. Haney.
Now, again, with Colonel Tom, there was a reason why Elvis never traveled overseas. You know that story?
No, I don't.
No, apparently Colonel Tom, and he had I believe a Scandinavian surname anyway, but apparently Colonel Tom was not a citizen of the U.S., so there were some things that were amiss. So that's why, other than perhaps Hawaii, which at that point was a U.S. territory or state by the time Elvis went there, that he never did a European or an Asian tour, because Colonel Tom, if he tried to leave the country, well, he might not have been able to get back in. So that explains a lot about Elvis's kind of confinement, if you know what I'm saying. So, but anyway, that's my Elvis story with Colonel Tom. Pat might not have been a superstar, but that was fine by him. A quote from the book: "Stars get out of work, but sidekicks go on forever," Pat told a reporter back in the day, and he's absolutely right. Sidekicks are always good, always good. Stars, they can go along their merry way, but the sidekicks always seem to have work.
Yeah, that's right.
Indeed. John, did you ever get to visit the set when he was doing Green Acres?
Not with Green Acres. I got to be on a set when they were filming one of the Death Valley days at Melody Ranch. And then he made a movie here in Dallas with Hank Williams Jr. And it had to be shelved because Hank Williams had fell off a cliff and messed up his face. And so his face changed quite a bit from when he made the movie. So that was never released.
Gotcha. Another quote from the book: "Pat's mind was sharp, and he was always coming up with ideas." And Sandy, you talk in the book that his imagination was so rampant that sometimes he'd come up with ideas in the middle of the night. How would he handle that?
Yeah, well, I think all writers can relate to it, because in the time between wake and sleep, there's a beautiful little area of time that we're most creative. And he, just like many writers, kept pencil and paper by the bed.
Indeed.
An idea, he wrote it down before he lost it, because if he waited till morning, it might be gone.
John, late 60s, Pat became a long association with Walt Disney Pictures, which utilized Pat's vocal talents. He was in several movies. I know the Aristocats was one, and he did several others for Disney. Even got to meet Walt back in the day. He must have enjoyed that, doing that voiceover work as well.
Yeah, he did the Sheriff of Nottingham. He in Robin Hood, and then he was in the Rescuers. Of course, the Aristocats, and Fox and the Hounds.
And I know the Aristocats, I'm sure the others, again, they had a habit of every 5 or 10 years re-releasing those. So again, hopefully the money was still coming in back in those days.
And Ava Gabor was in that movie too, so he got to work with her again.
Oh yeah, she played the sophisticated feline, I believe, or was she? Yeah, she was a cat in that movie. There you go.
Right.
That's why they called it the Aristocats. There you go. Now, Sandy, 1975, kind of a bittersweet year. While Pat was, of course, still working, Green Acres had ended. He lost his wife, Sheila. She had been ill for a couple of years, and then also had another freak accident. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Oh, he was taking a shower, and apparently the soap must have had some slippery aspect to it, and he fell, and his arm went through the glass door, and it severed his small finger. So, of course, he went right to the hospital, and he told them just cut it off, not just at where you see the finger begin, but all the way down to the wrist. And that way it'll look more natural. And I was looking at a commercial he did later, and his hands were in view, and I could see where that was, but it wouldn't have looked unusual if I hadn't been looking for it.
And now, John, you would know, was that his writing hand, or was that his non-dominant hand?
Oh, you're not have to stop and think.
Never been asked that question, John, huh?
No, I haven't, and I know he did.
Picture
deal with Gene Autry.
Picture him signing some checks. Was he using his good hand or his not so good hand?
I really can't remember. I was just trying to picture some of it. But
there you go.
Yeah, I can tell you.
Oh, okay. Sandy knows. Okay.
Left hand.
I'm sorry, hon?
He was left-handed, though.
He was left-handed. So, but the accident was on his right hand?
Yeah, I don't know if he was left-handed, but the finger was on his left.
Oh, okay. Very good. Very good. So those of you who think it happened during Green Acres, don't go looking at Mr. Haney's hand, because it came much later on. Now, in the early 80s, I guess Pat started, he was getting into his, mid-60s, late 60s. Thought maybe, work was starting to slow up a little bit. At one point, John, he moved back to Alabama. He didn't stay there too long, did he?
No. Pat thought he wasn't in real good health, and so he moved back to Alabama to kind of be back with his roots. And he got to feeling better and missed California and everybody out there, so he went back out.
Indeed.
And,
1988, he gets awarded with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, well deserved. And something I came across recently, 1990, I didn't know, returned to Green Acres, which was great because before they started to pass, reunited the entire cast. So that must have been a fun time for them as well. Well, we've enjoyed spending time with you folks. You guys have shared some great memories with your not only relative but also subject matter, Mr. Pat Buttram, Mr. Haney, as I want to call him, Sandra Grabman, Sandy, the author of this marvelous book, Rocking Chair Humorist. We thank you for spending your time with us here on Studio 411.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. We enjoyed having you. An actor as well as nephew of Pat Buttram, Mr. John Buttram. John, leave us with a saying or two of your uncle.
Well, let's see. It's kind of hard to remember all of them off the top of my head,
Give me a couple off the top of your head.
Can't think of them right now. You hit me pretty cold.
Sandy, give us one and he can repeat it.
Okay, I'm looking through the book.
Let's see. Oh,
There you go. Yeah.
there we go. We can edit this in. All right, go ahead. I'm looking too. All right. How about this one? Why do men spend $3 for a shirt and then cover all but a nickel's worth with a coat and a vest?
Yeah. Oh, and you know what? In the book, of course, I have little vignette.
Vignettes.
Yeah, vignettes, Pat's one-liners interspersed throughout it. And when we did the audio book, John read Pat's words when he's telling those jokes.
How about this one, John? Money does talk. Do you remember the end of that one?
No.
Money does talk. It'll say goodbye awful easy. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're going to send him a copy of this book. He needs to brush up on these Pat Buttram.
You know, I've got a copy, and before
Before
Sandy made the second one, we got
its-
together with a couple of people I knew, and so she got quite a lot more information to put in the second book.
It's in its second edition, so we've got to make sure
Right.
he's up to date on things. Well, you guys hang on.
I will
with
tell you a couple of things. On Mr. Haney, he'd always say different things about him, and he'd say, you know, Haney's the kind of fella that has rubber-lined pockets so he can steal soup.
On that note, we thank you both for joining us, and we thank you for joining us here on this episode of Studio 411. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Larry DeSilva's my name. We look forward to seeing you again real soon. Take care.